I was already 3 months into the underwater lab when I noticed the security cameras never lingered on certain patients, as if the system itself chose to look away. That morning, I was exhausted, fingers numb from recycled cold air, staring at a man whose vitals were stable, despite the fact that his chest hadn't moved since admission. I remember checking the glass for fog, then my own reflection, wondering when breathing stopped being something I expected to see. That's when a senior nurse quietly reminded me there were 11 strange rules we follow to stay alive down here, and that forgetting even one doesn't always kill you immediately. She said it like a warning she'd already failed to obey. The nurse didn't wait for me to answer when she leaned in and told me Rule 1. Never ask a patient why they aren't breathing, even if they are awake. Her voice low enough that the patient couldn't hear, or maybe low enough that the walls wouldn't. I nodded like I understood, even though my mind snagged on the word awake, because the man on the bed was watching us with eyes that tracked movement too deliberately. I told myself this place had protocols stranger than my medical school nightmares, that underwater pressure warped more than instruments and clocks. Still, the idea that a conscious human could exist without the simple rhythm of breath pressed against something basic in me. I didn't argue, because arguing down here always felt like you were giving the walls permission to listen. The patient's name was redacted on the display, replaced with a string of characters that reset every few minutes, and that alone should have warned me. I focused instead on the thin line of data pulsing across the monitor, steady and almost mocking in its normality. His skin wasn't blue, wasn't pale, wasn't doing any of the things I'd been trained to react to, and that made my hands restless. I found myself watching his throat, waiting for a swallow that never came, counting seconds I pretended not to count. When his eyes flicked toward me again, there was no plea there, only something like expectation. I tried to ground myself in routine, adjusting settings that didn't need adjusting, annotating observations with language so careful it bordered on dishonest. The nurse stayed by the door, arms folded, gaze fixed on a point just above the patient's head, as if meeting his eyes would invite conversation. I asked her how long he'd been like this, and she answered with a time range so wide it became meaningless. Down here people spoke in approximations, especially when precision might implicate someone. I told myself this was about liability, not fear. When the shift change alarm flashed, it didn't bring relief the way it should have, because I realized no one was coming to replace me yet. The schedule had been altered again, a silent update pushed through the system without explanation, and my name sat there alone. I felt the lab tilt, not physically, but in that subtle way your trust shifts when authority makes a quiet decision on your behalf. The patient's eyes followed my movement as I crossed the room, and I wondered if he noticed the change too. I wondered how many updates he'd outlasted. I caught myself leaning closer to the glass, studying the faint condensation on the outside, searching for any sign of warmth on the other side. There was none, and that absence felt curated rather than accidental, like someone had learned how to remove just that detail. The nurse cleared her throat softly, a gesture that meant stop without ever forming the word. She didn't look at me when she said that observation rounds were complete, and that we should minimize interaction. The phrase sounded rehearsed, passed down intact from someone who no longer worked here. I stepped back, but the urge to understand kept scratching at me, an itch beneath gloves I couldn't remove. In training, unanswered questions were temporary obstacles, puzzles you could solve with persistence and data. Here, questions felt like trespassing, like opening a door marked private and discovering the sign was there to protect you. I remembered how recruitment brochures talked about pioneering medicine, about expanding human limits, and how none of them mentioned learning when not to know something. My chest felt tight, and I hated that it did, because it felt like surrender. The patient shifted slightly then, not enough to trigger alarms, but enough to prove intention. His gaze locked onto mine, and for a moment I was certain he was about to speak, to explain himself in a way that would make all of this make sense. I leaned forward despite myself, already forming words I knew I shouldn't use. The nurse's hand closed around my wrist, not hard, but with the certainty of someone who'd done this before. She shook her head once, slowly, and I felt something inside me recalibrate. I asked instead if he was comfortable, a question so harmless it barely qualified as medical. His lips curved, not into a smile, but into a shape that suggested he understood the substitution. He didn't answer, and I realized I hadn't actually expected him to. The nurse released my wrist and moved to log the interaction, her fingers steady in a way mine weren't. I wondered how many substitutions like that filled the records, how much truth had been quietly rerouted into safer channels. As hours stretched, the lab's artificial day cycled through its phases, lights warming and cooling on a schedule that ignored the ocean outside. Fatigue crept in sideways, not as sleepiness, but as a dulling of edges, making unacceptable things feel routine. I noticed how easily I stopped checking the patient's chest, how quickly my eyes slid past the absence that had bothered me earlier. That realization scared me more than the initial impossibility, because it meant adaptation was already happening. Authority didn't need to enforce compliance when familiarity would do the work. Near the end of my extended shift, a message flashed briefly on my console, then vanished before I could read it fully. I caught only fragments, enough to recognize an administrative tone, enough to know it wasn't meant for patients. The nurse pretended not to notice, her attention fixed elsewhere with practiced ease. I thought about asking her what it said, but the impulse died before reaching my mouth. Silence had become a shared language here, one that didn't require explanation. When I finally prepared to leave, logging out of systems that felt less transparent than they claimed, I took one last look at the man on the bed. His eyes were closed now, or perhaps just unfocused, and without that gaze the room felt strangely emptier. I told myself that whatever he was, whatever process sustained him, was above my clearance and outside my responsibility. The thought was meant to comfort me, but it rang hollow, like a slogan repeated too often. As I stepped into the corridor, the door sealing behind me with patient inevitability, I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd heard someone breathe down here. The hum of systems filled every space, masking subtler truths, and I wondered if that was intentional. I walked away telling myself I'd done the right thing by not asking, by respecting boundaries set by people who knew more than I did. Still, the image of that unmoving chest followed me, and I had the unsettling sense that something essential had just been edited out of my understanding, leaving a gap that authority expected me not to notice. The first time I realized the gravity of Rule 2. Never adjust the life support flow for curiosity, even if a patient seems stable. I was alone in the observation bay, staring at the gauges that hummed in rhythms I barely understood. The patient in bed was quiet, chest still, eyes occasionally flicking open, as if measuring me the way I measured him. My hands itched to tweak a dial just slightly, just to see how sensitive the system really was, just to prove that stability was real. I reminded myself of the nurse's words from earlier, that down here, even harmless curiosity could spiral into irreversible outcomes, and yet my fingers hovered, trembling, over the controls I was never supposed to touch. I thought about what stable really meant. The monitors were obedient, repeating their graphs with mechanical precision, yet something in the patient's gaze suggested that stability was an illusion, a performance maintained by rules we didn't fully understand. I remembered reading once that deep water physiology can mask distress, how oxygen saturation can appear normal even when tissue is starving. The notion that I could manipulate flow without consequence felt simultaneously thrilling and reprehensible. I shook my head, trying to ground myself in protocol, but the isolation of the lab made it easy for imagination to override reason. The room was quiet, except for the hum of recycled air, though the pressurized water outside seemed to press a steady rhythm against the glass, as if tapping along with my heartbeat. I imagined what would happen if I adjusted just a single valve, if the patient responded, or didn't, or if the life support itself began to hiccup under the pressure of my interference. I told myself I wasn't thinking about the danger. I was merely conducting an experiment in observation. But when I noticed a subtle ripple in the liquid around the patient, something that shouldn't have been there. My curiosity tangled with fear. It reminded me why the rule existed, though I hadn't yet seen the consequences firsthand. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time was difficult to track when isolation distorted perception. I paced the room, trying to stay sharp, trying to convince myself I was vigilant. The patient shifted slightly, just enough to unsettle me, and I realized the imperceptible motions were the only indicators of life. My desire to tinker with the controls returned, more insistent, whispering that I could just test one minor adjustment. I reminded myself that Rule 2, never adjust the life support flow for curiosity, even if a patient seems stable, a mantra to counter the subtle temptation. Saying it aloud didn't calm me. The word stable seemed to mock my inability to resist interference. I found myself studying the life support panel in microscopic detail, tracing each line of tubing, imagining where minor pressure changes could travel. The hum of machinery became oppressive, vibrating through the floor, into my hands, urging me to act. I questioned whether my caution was learned prudence or sheer fear of being reprimanded. I thought about past incidents I wasn't officially privy to, whispered warnings passed down by nurses who had survived too many early careers. The memory of one technician, hospitalized after a minor experiment, surfaced, and I realized how narrow the margin of error really was. As the lab lights cycled dimly, casting elongated shadows across the floor, I felt my willpower faltering. The patient's eyes opened again, this time following me more deliberately, as if tracking the intentions behind my hands rather than the actions themselves. I imagined what it would be like to adjust a valve, just enough to elicit a reaction, a twitch, a proof of control. I shivered, knowing that a single miscalculation could propagate through the system faster than I could respond. The isolation pressed in from every wall, making indecision feel like the wrong choice, even when it was the safest. I reached for the console once, hesitated, then pulled back sharply. My pulse raced in tandem with the electronic hum, and I realized the rule wasn't merely precaution, it was survival. The temptation to test boundaries was not dangerous because of the machine alone, but because the patient, the water, the pressure, and the unspoken hierarchy of authority conspired to punish even minor transgressions. I reminded myself that curiosity here was a luxury I couldn't afford, even if every instinct screamed that knowledge was power. The distinction was cruelly subtle. By the midpoint of the shift, my mind had started fragmenting. The unbroken monotony of systems, the silence of empty corridors, the patient's unmoving form, all of it wove into a pressure that began to distort perception. I imagined numbers fluctuating on the monitors that weren't actually there, readings bending under the weight of my imagination. Every attempt to focus on the present was undermined by hypothetical outcomes, and I realized that Rule 2, never adjust the life support flow for curiosity, even if a patient seemed stable, wasn't just a precaution. It was a safeguard against the slow erosion of reality. The nurse returned briefly for a check, her presence grounding me just enough to avoid touching the controls, but her absence left me floating in my own panic. I walked the perimeter of the observation bay, counting the panels, counting the empty space, counting the seconds until my shift would end. The patient didn't move, didn't react, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was aware of my thoughts, of the minor impulses I fought to suppress. The temptation to manipulate the system lingered in every shadow, every gauge, every reflection on the glass. By the end of my extended shift, I had not touched the controls, yet exhaustion had left me frayed. Every nerve felt raw, and the isolation pressed against my ribs, heavy enough to make breathing feel optional. I realized the rule had worked, not because I had adhered to it perfectly, but because it forced vigilance, restraint, and awareness that the margin between safety and disaster was microscopic. I glanced at the patient one last time before leaving, and though he lay perfectly still, I felt his observation like a physical weight. Stepping into the corridor, I exhaled deeply, though it didn't relieve the tightness in my chest. I understood that curiosity was dangerous, not for the answers it provided, but for the momentum it created in a system designed to punish even minor transgressions. The quiet warning echoed in my mind as I moved away, each step a reminder that boundaries here were literal lifelines. And somewhere in the lab, the life support continued its quiet hum, sustaining the patient and my sense of fragile safety, even as the temptation to interfere never fully disappeared. The first time I ignored Rule 3, never enter the patient's personal chamber alone after dark, I didn't think about it as rebellion. I thought about it as necessity, an itch I couldn't scratch, a question gnawing at the edges of my mind. The lab lights dimmed automatically, cycling into the night phase, and the hallway outside the chamber felt longer than it should have. The pressure of the ocean outside pressed against the thick acrylic walls, making every footstep feel heavier, slower, deliberate. I told myself I was just checking the patient's vitals in person. That proximity could give insight no screen ever could. But the moment I opened the seal, a flicker of doubt slithered into my chest. The chamber smelled of antiseptic, mixed with the faint tang of seawater that somehow infiltrated the ventilation system. My boots made a muted scrape on the floor as I stepped closer to the patient, who was sitting upright, eyes open, but still entirely silent. It wasn't the emptiness of his gaze that unsettled me. It was the patience behind it, like he had been expecting me. I rationalized that my training had prepared me for anomalies, for patients who defied charts and graphs, but nothing could prepare you for a conscious presence that didn't breathe. Every instinct screamed to back away, yet I leaned in, studying the faint condensation on the chamber glass, trying to decode a secret I wasn't supposed to know. I remembered a conversation from orientation, years ago, about staff injuries and disappearances in personal chambers, the way the incident reports vanished from the system, as if they had never existed. I shook my head, trying to dislodge the creeping paranoia. The patient's head tilted slightly, a micro gesture almost imperceptible, and I felt my heart kick against my ribs, as though it were trying to escape. I reminded myself that I wasn't alone in the observation bay, yet the corridor outside was empty, and the nurse's shift was long over. For the first time, I felt the isolation described in the manuals, the sense that down here, the rules were life itself, not guidelines. The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop suddenly, though the readouts remained normal, and I felt the cold seep into my bones. I glanced at the monitoring screens, and the readings made no sense. They were normal, perfectly stable, and yet every sensory signal screamed danger. My mind started to trace scenarios, each more impossible than the last, each one culminating in a warning I had learned too late. I wanted to speak, to break the silence, but my voice caught in my throat, stilled by some unspoken authority. The room's shadows shifted as if alive, teasing my perception, and I realized that in isolation, time itself begins to warp. I moved closer to the patient's side, almost instinctively, and noticed small details that had escaped me before. The subtle twitch of fingers, the faint pulse of veins visible beneath skin that should have been pale or mottled. My hands shook despite gloves, and I caught myself imagining what a single misstep could trigger. The patient didn't move, didn't react, yet his awareness seemed to press against me from every angle. I wondered if he understood more than I ever would, if he was silently judging the boundaries I had crossed. The thought chilled me more than any pressure or temperature reading ever could. I considered retreating, but something held me there, a compulsion I couldn't name, a mix of fear and fascination. The lights overhead flickered briefly, not enough to trigger alarms, but enough to make shadows crawl across walls and floors unnaturally. I told myself the shadows were a trick of perception, a result of fatigue and the hum of machinery, but my gut insisted otherwise. Every nerve in my body pulsed in anticipation, like it knew something I hadn't yet observed. I wanted to document everything meticulously, to reduce the impossible to data I could process, but the rules were clear. Documentation alone could not protect me. The patient's eyes shifted subtly again, tracking my motion with a patience that made my stomach knot. I realized that the rule existed not just to protect the patient or maintain protocol, but to protect me from my own curiosity and its consequences. I reminded myself that Rule 3, never enter the patient's personal chamber alone, after dark, was a boundary meant to contain events that logic couldn't explain. Yet as I stood there, in the dim pressurized silence, the rule felt both protective and punitive. The very act of being aware of it seemed to draw me closer to its hidden danger. I traced the outlines of the equipment surrounding the patient, imagining the network of tubes, monitors, and sensors like a delicate ecosystem, all dependent on order and restraint. One misstep, one touch of a dial, one misplaced step could destabilize it. My eyes caught a reflection in the chamber glass that didn't match my movement exactly, a subtle echo that made me question whether I had moved at all. I stepped back instinctively, the chamber suddenly feeling impossibly tight, and my mind raced for rational explanations. The isolation pressed in, distorting reality, making me question whether the rule existed to protect me or to test me. By the time I forced myself to step back, I realized I had been in the chamber longer than I intended, trapped in an invisible gravity that seemed to anchor me to that space. The patient's gaze followed me to the door, unblinking, unjudging, yet somehow intimate in its awareness. I closed the seal quietly, hands trembling, and the sound of the mechanism locking echoed like a punctuation mark in a narrative I didn't understand. Every step down the corridor afterward felt unsteady, my body and mind unsettled in a way that data or training couldn't fix. Later, when I recounted the night to myself in fragmented thoughts, I realized that the rule had never been about the mechanics of entry or exit, or even the physical safety of the chamber. It had been about restraint, about maintaining distance from phenomena that humans are not designed to confront alone. The rule demanded vigilance, not just of the body, but of the mind, and its violation left invisible scars that made the familiar unfamiliar. I walked away, the weight of the ocean pressing on the facility from every side, and understood that even compliance with some rules could never erase the memory of breaking another. I realized the danger of Rule 4. Never attempt communication beyond the observation panel. Without authorization, the first time I heard the faint thrum of voices filtered through the lab intercom. Voices that weren't meant for my ears. The patient in front of me seemed almost casual, yet I felt a pulse of panic, because the messages were not just background noise. They were warnings, subtle and coded, slipping past my conscious mind. I had considered tapping a quick question into the comm system, curiosity pressing at the edges of my restraint, but the thought alone made the skin on my neck prickle. Even harmless inquiries could cascade into events I wasn't equipped to handle. My hands hovered over the console, frozen in indecision, a silent rebellion against the invisible rules that dictated survival. The first few minutes after my near contact with the intercom were torturous. I watched the patient's chest, or lack thereof, thinking about what authority meant in this environment, and whether compliance really protected you, or simply postponed consequence. The corridors beyond the observation bay remained eerily empty, lights flickering in a pattern that suggested both maintenance and deliberate design. I reminded myself of the nurse's whispered warnings, that even curiosity routed through the wrong channel could ripple outward like pressure waves in the surrounding water. My thoughts were heavy, thick, dragging against the steady hum of ventilation and machinery that was supposed to lull me into security. I considered for a brief, irrational moment that maybe the patient could answer, that perhaps this silent observer had insight into the network of rules I had barely begun to understand. But the temptation to reach out and breach that boundary felt like a physical pull, something tugging at the core of my decision-making. The intercom offered no immediate response, just static and layered echoes that played tricks on perception. I imagined what might happen if I sent a simple query. Would someone respond, or would the system itself react with consequences I couldn't predict? I realized that the rule existed not to constrain communication, but to protect cognition from the subtle erosion caused by even small violations. Time warped as I lingered near the panel, noting the patient's calm demeanor and the impossibility of his condition. The normality of the instruments conflicted with the abnormality of his presence, creating a dissonance that made every decision feel loaded. I imagined the intercom's hidden channels like veins beneath the surface, channels that carried authority, consequence, and knowledge simultaneously. A single misstep could release pressures I was neither trained for nor prepared to manage. Even standing there, my attention divided between instruments and intuition. I felt the gravity of isolation pressing inward, bending my perception of seconds into minutes and minutes into hours. The patient's gaze tracked my movement again, a subtle tilt of his head that implied understanding beyond simple observation. I felt a shiver of fear, not for my physical safety, but for the creeping uncertainty that the patient's awareness could detect my smallest impulses. Every fiber of my attention was pulled between fascination and dread, and I realized that Rule 4, never attempt communication beyond the observation panel without authorization, was not just about policy. It was about preserving the fragile boundary between knowledge and overload. I thought of how often tiny transgressions had rippled outward in whispers and anomalies I could never fully track. By the midpoint of my shift, I began cataloging mental notes: what had been observed, what remained unexplained, the gaps in the intercom's transmission, the subtle motions of the patient. My mind circled endlessly around the consequences of breaking protocol, imagining worst-case scenarios that stretched plausibility. The patient remained still, silent, yet every unspoken cue carried weight. I wondered how many previous observers had ignored the rule, and what invisible mark it left behind. Fatigue and isolation made these hypotheticals feel tangible, like a presence pressing at the glass, reminding me of the danger of assuming stability. Later, as I traced the lines of tubing and cabling feeding the chamber, I realized the architecture itself reinforced the rule. Each panel, each conduit seemed designed to limit unsupervised contact, a system built with centuries of accumulated precaution encoded into steel and glass. I thought about how authority, like the water pressing on the lab, was invisible yet unrelenting. A minor lapse in judgment could ripple through both technology and human oversight, and I understood why the patient remained observed but isolated. The rule wasn't arbitrary. It was a shield woven into the environment itself, silent but unyielding. By the end of the observation cycle, I felt the mental strain pressing like physical pressure. Each movement, each glance toward the intercom, carried weight. I realized that down here, isolation doesn't just separate bodies, it distorts perception, making every decision feel simultaneously urgent and insignificant. Even minor curiosity was dangerous, because the consequences were slow, cumulative, and unpredictable. I had adhered to the rule, yet the residue of temptation lingered, a low hum behind every thought. The patient's eyes followed me as I left, calm and unreadable, and I wondered whether the rule existed to protect me, the patient, or both simultaneously. When I finally stepped out of the observation bay and into the corridor, the hum of machinery seemed louder, more intrusive, a reminder that silence and compliance were part of a larger system I barely understood. Every shadow, every reflected light, every faint vibration of the water against the hull seemed to whisper the rule again, without words. The lesson of restraint, pressed in authority, curiosity, and knowledge are entangled here, and breaching one thread could unravel the delicate balance holding everything together. I moved on with a strange vigilance, acutely aware that even indirect observation could betray intent. I first understood Rule 5. Never leave the monitoring console unattended when a patient's vitals are untraceable during a night shift that began like any other, with recycled air and dimmed lights pressing against my temples. The patient's vitals had been flat for hours. Nothing on the monitors, nothing in the charts, but the system still expected attention. I told myself it was routine, that I'd simply keep watch until the next shift arrived. But as minutes stretched into hours, the absence of measurable life became oppressive, a hollow weight that pressed through the glass and into my chest. Every time I looked away, I felt an imperceptible tug, like the patient's gaze could reach through the monitors and follow my hesitation. The console's lights pulsed faintly, rhythmic and almost soothing, yet every blink felt like a countdown. I considered stepping away for even a moment, to use the restroom or check my own vitals, but my instincts screamed that any lapse could invite catastrophe. I reminded myself of past incidents I'd heard whispered in training, cases where untraceable vitals coincided with minor procedural errors and ended with missing personnel. My hands hovered over the controls, not out of curiosity, but out of a primal need to maintain some semblance of order. The room felt smaller with every tick of the clock, the walls closing in imperceptibly as the ocean pressed on the other side of the hull. Hours passed, yet no one relieved me. The emptiness of the lab amplified every minor sound, the hum of systems, the faint drip of condensation, even the subtle vibrations in the hull. My focus oscillated between the patient and the monitors, my thoughts looping obsessively over what untraceable meant. I tried recalling protocols, comforting myself that vigilance alone was protective, but the absence of data made that reassurance fragile. Every reflection on the glass seemed to contain movement that wasn't mine, subtle and fleeting, enough to make my heart skip. I realized isolation warped not just perception, but reasoning, distorting seconds into eternity. At one point, I thought I saw a flicker on the monitors, a brief surge of numbers that disappeared before I could read them. My pulse accelerated, and I froze, unsure whether I had imagined it or if the patient had somehow interacted with the system beyond normal capability. I debated calling the nurse or another officer, but Rule 5, never leave the monitoring console unattended when a patient's vitals are untraceable, rang in my mind, a barrier between protocol and panic. Every instinct screamed for consultation, yet the rule demanded restraint, a discipline I wasn't sure I possessed. I felt the walls of the lab shrink as indecision settled like sediment around my thoughts. I traced the conduits, buttons and alarms on the console obsessively, memorizing every detail in case something changed. The patient remained still, eyes closed, yet the sense of observation was palpable, as if his consciousness extended through the room's boundaries. I imagined what would happen if I left for a mere minute, if the vitals shifted, or the system reacted in ways I couldn't predict. Every minor tremor of the hull, every shift in the filtered lighting, seemed magnified, laden with consequence. The rule wasn't arbitrary, it was a safeguard, not just for the patient, but for anyone who underestimated how quickly control could dissolve. Hours bled into an indistinct gray, where time lost meaning. My limbs ached, my thoughts jittered between reality and imagination. I caught myself tapping the console compulsively, not to change settings but to reassure myself that I was still engaged. The patient's presence felt more acute than any measurable vital sign, more demanding than any charted anomaly. I realized that adherence to the rule wasn't just about monitoring, it was about maintaining proximity to a fragile balance that could collapse in a single lapse of attention. The thought made me hyper-aware of every breath, every heartbeat, even though the monitors registered none. By late shift, fatigue had begun distorting perception. The console lights appeared to pulse with intent. Shadows in the room stretched and flickered unnaturally, and the patient's stillness felt less like calm and more like expectation. I wanted to step away, to allow myself a few minutes of relief, but fear and ingrained discipline kept me anchored. I reminded myself that even brief inattention could create cascading failures, the consequences invisible until irreversible. The hum of machinery filled the silence, masking subtle anomalies that might have been warning signs, making vigilance both exhausting and necessary. I imagined what might have occurred if I abandoned the console for even an instant, the patient reacting unpredictably, life support systems fluctuating, a chain of events beyond my comprehension. The possibility pressed on me like the ocean itself, omnipresent and immutable. I understood that the rule existed not only to protect immediate life, but to enforce awareness of limits, personal, procedural, and environmental. Compliance was not passive, it demanded constant engagement, a mental tether that bound me to reality, even as isolation threatened to dissolve it. Toward the end of my watch, I noticed subtle anomalies I might have ignored had the rule not anchored my attention. The faintest twitch of a fingertip, a shift in temperature not reflected in the readings, a movement in shadow that didn't belong to me. I cataloged them mentally, wary of over-interpreting, yet aware that missing even one detail could be disastrous. The rule had forced focus, but it had also exposed me to the relentless psychological erosion of constant vigilance. I stepped back momentarily to breathe, though the tension remained lodged in my chest, a reminder that even compliance could be exhausting, even dangerous. When my relief finally arrived, I hesitated to leave the console. My body screamed for movement, but my mind clung to the familiarity of monitoring, the only thing that kept the impossible patient grounded in comprehensible terms. I realized that the rule was not simply a guideline, it was a survival mechanism, demanding more than obedience. It demanded immersion, attention, and the suppression of natural instincts to flee or question. Even as I walked away, the sense of watchfulness remained, a weight pressing against my perception that extended beyond the physical lab walls. I learned the weight of Rule 6. Never attempt to move a patient's body without a second observer present the hard way, though I didn't understand it at first. It was during a routine chamber check, when I noticed the patient's position had shifted slightly. Subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to unsettle me. My instinct screamed to adjust him, to align monitors and tubes, to restore order. But a memory of whispered warnings rattled in my mind. I realized then that the rule wasn't about the mechanics of movement or medical protocol. It was about containment, about preventing the consequences of being alone with something you can't fully comprehend. The very thought of violating it made the pressurized walls seem closer, heavier, as if aware of my intent. The patient's eyes tracked my hesitation with unnerving calm, and every micro-movement felt magnified in the dim chamber lighting. I reached for the side of the bed, hesitating just short of contact, feeling the pull of instinct against the caution drilled into me. It wasn't that I doubted my training. It was that training assumed a rational world, one governed by physics and physiology. Down here, those rules bent under isolation, under water pressure, under the strange consciousness of patients who existed outside normal definitions. I reminded myself aloud of the rule, trying to anchor my thoughts to it, but the words felt like thin tethers against something vast and incomprehensible. I considered waiting for a second observer, but the shift schedule left me alone for hours. Every step away from the patient seemed to amplify my awareness of the chamber's silence, of the faint hum in the walls, and the way the ocean pressed against the facility with slow, consistent force. I circled the bed, noting tubing, monitoring lines, and the faint condensation patterns on glass, each tiny detail a potential hazard if mishandled. I imagined what might happen if I moved him alone. A minor displacement cascading into system errors, subtle malfunctions escalating into outcomes I could neither predict nor correct. The rule felt less like a guideline and more like a physical law. The temptation to act grew stronger the longer I waited. It was an itch beneath my gloves, a whisper in the rhythm of my heartbeat, urging me to intervene, to restore order, to assert control. I shook my head, trying to maintain clarity, telling myself that the rule existed for reasons beyond my immediate understanding. My pulse quickened as I studied the patient's still form, noting a twitch in a fingertip, the faint flutter of eyelids, and the impression of awareness that seemed to extend far beyond his body. The ocean outside pressed relentlessly against the hull, and I felt a subtle alignment of pressure between my nervous system and the environment itself. I imagined what a second observer would notice, how their presence might stabilize the room's equilibrium, how even their silent monitoring could alter outcomes. Alone, I felt every anomaly magnified, every imperfection a potential threat. The patient remained passive, yet I sensed awareness behind those eyes, measuring my restraint, my hesitation, my intent. Every breath I forced myself to take felt deliberate, as if the act of inhaling could trigger unseen consequences. I realized that Rule 6, never attempt to move a patient's body without a second observer present, wasn't simply procedural, it was protective, a tether holding me to reason in a system that could otherwise erase it. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. Time seemed irrelevant under the combined weight of pressure, isolation, and vigilance. My muscles cramped, my vision blurred at the edges, yet I remained stationed near the bed, unwilling to break the rule, unwilling to risk unknown consequences. Shadows shifted across the chamber walls with subtle irregularity, magnifying my sense of unease. Every monitor read perfectly normal, yet the very stillness of the patient felt unnatural, deliberate, a quiet pressure against my consciousness. I questioned whether I was truly alone, or if the system itself counted as the second observer, a mechanical presence that could enforce rules silently and without judgment. By the midpoint of my watch, fatigue had set in like a physical weight. I adjusted my stance, tapped fingers against the console, cataloging every minor anomaly, every twitch, every imperceptible change in the chamber environment. The patient's gaze remained on me, unflinching, patient, and impossibly aware, and I felt the fragile boundary between action and consequence tighten. I imagined the chaos a single misjudged movement could cause: tubes dislodged, alarms tripped, unseen forces triggered, and all because I ignored a rule designed to prevent catastrophe. The realization settled into my chest like concrete. This was more than protocol, it was survival. Later, when the second observer finally arrived, I stepped back, tension flooding my limbs. Relief didn't come immediately. The patient's stillness and silent awareness remained oppressive. I watched as the observer completed the adjustments, noting the patient's subtle compliance and the delicate navigation of instruments and lines. The experience left me profoundly aware of the rule's invisible power. Even passive observation had meaning. I felt my own perception shift, recalibrated to account for the boundaries I had observed, but not crossed. The isolation had taught me that restraint could be as important as action, perhaps even more so. By the end of the shift, I was exhausted beyond words. Every nerve in my body remained alert, not from physical danger, but from psychological vigilance, from the knowledge that a minor lapse could unravel control, that isolation distorted both perception and consequence. I realized that Rule 6, never attempt to move a patient's body without a second observer present, functioned, not just as a protocol, but as a psychological anchor, ensuring I stayed tethered to procedure, sanity, and safety. Even compliance carried weight, shaping every observation, every decision, every breath I forced myself to take. I stepped into the corridor afterward, feeling the walls press against me, as if the facility itself exhaled, relieved I had respected the boundary. The patient remained in the chamber, perfectly still, yet impossibly present. I understood that some rules weren't about punishment, they were about containment, about preserving fragile equilibrium in an environment that otherwise allowed chaos to creep quietly through every imperceptible shift. The memory of restraint lingered, a quiet pressure pressing on my shoulders long after I left the observation bay. I learned the unforgiving truth of Rule 7. Never ignore fluctuations in chamber pressure, even if they seem minor during a night. When the water outside felt heavier than usual, pressing against the lab's hull with a subtle, insistent force, I noticed a minor deviation on the pressure gauge, barely a fraction off nominal, and my first thought was dismissive. It must be sensor drift. Nothing serious, but instinct gnawed at me, a low hum in the back of my mind, urging attention. I leaned closer, tracing lines of piping and support, feeling vibrations through the floor that I couldn't explain. The patient remained still, eyes half open, as if observing my hesitation, and I realized that underestimation could be as lethal as overt mistakes. I circled the chamber, adjusting monitoring instruments and jotting mental notes. Yet every movement felt inadequate. The fluctuations weren't dramatic. They were subtle, barely noticeable, almost like a pulse beneath the skin of the lab. Still, my training screamed caution. Even minor pressure changes can cascade through the life support system, tube connections, and structural integrity in ways imperceptible until failure. I noticed condensation forming along a seam I'd checked countless times before, micro movements that shouldn't have existed. I felt my own breath catch, realizing that the rule wasn't about paranoia, It was about survival in a system built to magnify tiny errors. The hum of the ocean outside seemed louder when I focused on the chamber, a low, omnipresent vibration that filled the room. I tapped the gauges lightly, adjusting readings mentally, trying to reconcile sensor data with sensory input. My pulse accelerated when a brief, imperceptible creak echoed from the far wall, the sound nearly swallowed by machinery, but impossible to ignore once heard. I imagined the consequences: tubes loosening, minor leaks propagating pressure drops, alarms that might trigger too late, or worse, fail silently. The rule existed to tether vigilance, to force attention when complacency would feel safer, but cost lives. Time became distorted as I monitored every fluctuation. Minutes stretched, then contracted, as I walked the perimeter, recalibrating, rereading, and rethinking each observation. The patient's gaze followed me in the reflection of the glass, patient and aware in a way that suggested he understood more about my oversight than I did myself. I felt the weight of isolation pressing against my cognitive boundaries, sharpening every perception and magnifying every error. The rule wasn't just about physical measurements. It was about how attention, or the lack thereof, could ripple outward and magnify unpredictably. By the midpoint of my vigil, the minor fluctuations had become almost imperceptible again, teasing me with normalcy. I wanted to step away, to allow myself a short reprieve, but even brief absence could propagate unseen consequences. My eyes scanned tubing, monitors and junctions endlessly, noting the subtle shifts in metal and condensation, the faint distortions in glass that suggested strain. Every instinct urged me to act decisively, but the rule reminded me that restraint, observation, and verification were just as critical as intervention. The tension coiled through me, as though the ocean's pressure had seeped into my muscles, making even small movements deliberate. I recalled a colleague's warning from my first week, vague in detail but memorable in tone. Even a small deviation becomes an avalanche underwater. The words reverberated in my mind as I crouched to inspect a joint near the chamber floor. My gloves brushed against tubing that didn't feel right, subtle warmth in an unexpected place. The patient's eyes tracked me, unblinking, and for a brief moment, I imagined a minor misstep triggering a reaction far beyond my comprehension. I reminded myself that Rule 7, never ignore fluctuations in chamber pressure, even if they seem minor, was not an arbitrary caution. It was a distilled survival instinct encoded into protocol by those who had already paid the price for oversight. Hours passed, or maybe moments. They were impossible to distinguish under the relentless pressure and hum of machinery. I rotated panels, verified calibration, and traced every conduit as if my attention alone could stabilize the system. Shadows stretched across the chamber in ways that defied logic, and I caught reflections of equipment that didn't align with my movements. Every anomaly felt amplified, every breath deliberate, and every pause loaded with potential consequence. Compliance with the rule felt less like procedure and more like ritual, a daily enactment of restraint that preserved both sanity and life. By the end of my shift, fatigue had set in, dulling my limbs but sharpening my focus in a strange way. The gauges were nominal, the chamber calm, and yet I remained aware of the pressure outside the walls, the subtle, unrelenting force that could shift in an instant. I realized the rule functioned as both guide and shield, training attention to detect the imperceptible before it became critical. My awareness had been heightened, my vigilance preserved by respect for this simple yet unforgiving instruction. Stepping out into the corridor, I felt the weight of water and isolation leave my limbs but not my mind. The patient remained still, yet I could sense presence, a subtle weight pressing from inside the chamber, a reminder that vigilance never truly ends. I understood that even minor neglect of this rule could ripple outward unpredictably, shaping outcomes I might never observe. As I walked away, I carried the echo of the ocean, the pressure in every wall, and the silent insistence that Rule 7, never ignore fluctuations in chamber pressure, even if they seem minor, was more than a guideline. It was the difference between control and catastrophe. I first felt the true weight of Rule 8. Never override the automated sedation schedule without explicit authorization when the alarms blinked faintly, signaling a patient who should have been sedated but wasn't. My instinct told me to act, to administer manually what the system hesitated to provide, but a deeper ingrained caution made my fingers freeze above the controls. I remembered the nurse's earlier warnings, whispered like sacred law down here. Even minor deviation from automation invites consequences invisible to the untrained eye. The patient's eyes were open, tracking my hesitation, unblinking and patient, and I realized that any action, even well-intentioned, could ripple through the system in ways I couldn't predict. The sedation schedule was precise, engineered to maintain stability across mental and physical functions. Yet the patient's awareness created a dissonance that the algorithm couldn't account for. I hovered over the console, watching readouts pulse with uncanny stillness, and felt a tension in my chest that was not entirely physical. Every instinct screamed to intervene, to assert control, but Rule 8, never override the automated sedation schedule without explicit authorization, anchored me to restraint. I reminded myself that the rule existed to protect both the patient and the observer, to prevent judgment from overriding the fragile balance the system maintained, and to prevent my human impulse from unraveling what logic had established. Hours crawled forward with the patient's eyes following my movements, and every decision felt laden with consequence. I double-checked the automated logs, ensuring I hadn't missed a directive that permitted intervention, but nothing authorized manual adjustment. Even the smallest deviation could cascade through not just sedation levels, but neural monitoring, oxygenation, and mechanical support, compounding into outcomes I couldn't anticipate. The rule was deceptively simple, but its enforcement demanded vigilance, patience, and absolute subordination to a system I only partially understood. I imagined what might have happened if I ignored the instruction, overridden the schedule out of curiosity or impatience. A momentary relief, yes, but followed by a series of imperceptible physiological and neurological feedback loops that could leave the patient irreparably altered. The patient shifted slightly, subtle enough that I only noticed after a careful glance, and I felt the weight of observation intensify. Isolation magnified every detail, every twitch, every reflection in the chamber glass, making me hyper-aware of what compliance truly meant in this context. Even adherence carried a psychological toll. By mid-shift, fatigue began gnawing at my attention, and the room's shadows twisted in ways that weren't entirely explained by the lighting cycle. I had to fight the urge to step away, to clear my head, because even brief distraction risked misinterpretation of subtle signals in the patient's condition. The automated schedule hummed reliably, a rhythm I clung to, yet my imagination painted scenarios where minor lapses would compound into disastrous effects. I realized that Rule 8, never override the automated sedation schedule without explicit authorization, wasn't merely about preventing physical harm. It was about protecting cognition, restraint, and understanding in an environment designed to erode both when rules are bent. The patient's eyes shifted to follow a reflection on the glass, a tiny motion that sent my thoughts spiraling. I mapped out every possible response I might have taken if the rule didn't exist, imagining cascading alarms, unexpected vital changes, and the quiet weight of authority exacting consequence in silence. The room seemed alive, but not in a way dictated by biology or mechanics. The awareness pressed in, subtle and omnipresent, enforcing boundaries I could not ignore. The isolation wasn't just spatial, it was cognitive, shaping perception of time, choice, and consequence. Later, when the scheduled shift change finally arrived, I realized how tethered I had been to the automated system. Even minor deviations had been suppressed by my adherence to Rule 8. Never override the automated sedation schedule without explicit authorization, yet the temptation to assert agency had left a lingering residue of tension in my mind. I understood that this rule protected more than life. It protected the observer from the insidious erosion of certainty and control. Even compliance demanded awareness, calculation, and self-restraint under pressure I couldn't fully quantify. By the end of my watch, I felt both relief and residual anxiety. The system had maintained its balance. The patient remained stable, yet I could still sense the constant scrutiny, the invisible presence enforcing compliance beyond physical observation. I understood that violating the rule, even once, could have been catastrophic, not only for the patient, but for me. The quiet weight of authority, the immutable hum of automation, and the patient's silent awareness combined into a lesson that would echo long after the shift ended. As I stepped into the corridor, the lights reflected on the glass panels in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. The patient remained immobile, yet his presence lingered, a quiet reminder of the rule's reach. I carried the awareness that the smallest act, even born of good intention, could unravel delicate equilibrium. Compliance wasn't passive. It demanded constant vigilance and respect for forces I could neither see nor fully comprehend. The lesson settled in, pressing in from every angle, a reminder that restraint can be as critical as action when survival depends on balance. I discovered the weight of Rule 9. Never attempt to record or transmit visual data of a patient's involuntary movements. One night, when the lab cameras caught a flicker on the patient's limbs, subtle, almost imperceptible, yet impossible to ignore, I considered saving the footage, documenting the anomaly for analysis, but the instinct to capture it immediately clashed with the rule drilled into me since day one. The patient's eyes seemed to track my hesitation, calm but insistent, as though aware of my internal struggle. I realized then that the rule existed to protect not only the patient but myself, to prevent observation from morphing into interference, and to prevent a single impulse from unraveling layers of fragile protocol. The movements were slight, a twitch in a finger, the subtle rotation of a wrist, but they felt deliberate, almost communicative. I hovered near the console, fingers brushing the buttons, imagining the consequences if I bypassed the rule. Transmission might trigger a cascade I couldn't predict, alarms muted, control systems overridden, subtle anomalies amplified. Isolation made every tiny detail feel amplified. The pressurized water outside pressing insistently against the hull, magnifying every internal sensation. My heartbeat quickened, not from physical exertion, but from the psychological weight of potential violation, the constant awareness that a single choice could have consequences beyond comprehension. I circled the observation bay, avoiding direct eye contact with the patient, yet feeling the invisible tether connecting my attention to him. I traced the cables and monitoring lines mentally, noting how each connected to mechanisms I didn't fully understand. Even the faintest attempt to document or transmit the involuntary movements would have constituted a breach of the system's integrity. I imagined previous technicians, perhaps overconfident in their control, documenting things they shouldn't, and wondered what invisible consequences had befallen them. The rule was not arbitrary. It was an unspoken safeguard against the erosion of boundaries and sanity. Hours passed, and fatigue crept into my awareness, distorting perception. The patient's involuntary movements persisted, subtle and consistent, yet I could not capture them. I felt a compulsion to prove something, to assert mastery over anomalies, but the rule anchored me. Every twitch, every reflection on the glass, every shadow in the room became an exercise in restraint. I reminded myself repeatedly that Rule 9, never attempt to record or transmit visual data of a patient's involuntary movements, existed, because even seemingly harmless documentation could propagate instability, imperceptible but irreversible. The weight of compliance pressed into every thought. I imagined the patient noticing my impulses, aware not only of my actions, but of my intent. The pressure of observation was mutual, a silent negotiation between my curiosity and the rule's authority. I tried to focus on vitals and environmental data, mentally cataloging every anomaly without touching the record function. The isolation magnified every sound, every vibration of the hull, every subtle flicker in the lighting, and I realized that breaking the rule could ripple outward beyond my own perception, touching systems, observers, and consequences I could never trace. Compliance demanded constant vigilance, more taxing than any physical task in the lab. By the midpoint of my shift, I had cataloged every twitch, subtle movement, and minor reflex in memory alone. My mind repeated the rule as a mantra, suppressing the urge to capture, to preserve, to transmit. I imagined how easy it would be to justify documentation, to rationalize the potential benefit against protocol, yet the patient's awareness and the isolation of the lab made the risk tangible, almost physical. The rule was protective not because it limited knowledge, but because it contained the psychological erosion that curiosity and action could induce in a place designed to destabilize both observer and observed. Later, I crouched near the patient's chamber, observing imperceptible shifts in muscle tone and breathing patterns. Every micro-movement seemed intentional, almost communicative, and I fought the urge to reach for the console. The silence pressed against me, the hum of machinery magnified by my vigilance. I realized that even passive observation required respect for boundaries, that the rule wasn't merely administrative, it was a safeguard against psychological contamination, a way to prevent observation from becoming interference. Every impulse to act or record was a test of my discipline and awareness. By the end of the watch, the involuntary movements continued, subtle and inscrutable. I had adhered strictly to Rule 9, never attempt to record or transmit visual data of a patient's involuntary movements, yet the tension persisted, lodged deep in my chest. Compliance required constant attention, heightened perception, and a mental tether to restraint. Even the absence of action carried weight, as each decision, each moment of observation, interacted with the patient, the environment, and the invisible system governing consequence. I understood then that the rule existed as both protection and anchor, guiding my awareness through a delicate equilibrium I could neither fully control nor ignore. Stepping into the corridor, I felt the isolation lessen, but the psychological residue remain. The patient's presence lingered behind the glass, calm yet impossibly aware, a reminder that restraint and compliance could weigh as heavily as action itself. I knew the rule had preserved not only the patient's stability, but my own tenuous grasp on control, focus, and reason. Even after leaving, the subtle impression of each movement persisted, etched into memory by the rule I had respected. I first felt the danger of Rule 10, never enter the maintenance tunnels, without notifying the command center, when a minor fault in the oxygen regulation forced me to consider an unauthorized inspection. The corridor lights dimmed in uneven pulses, shadows stretching like dark fingers along the walls, and the weight of isolation pressed harder with each step. I knew the tunnels were labyrinthine, designed for efficiency, but impossible to navigate without precise coordination. My fingers hovered over the communication panel, resisting the urge to bypass protocol, knowing that a single misstep could trap me in ways that no emergency procedure could easily resolve. The hatch leading to the tunnels felt heavier than it should, metal groaning under pressure, as if protesting my intrusion. My boots echoed unnaturally on the steel grating, and every vibration seemed amplified by the labyrinth beneath me. I imagined previous technicians, some perhaps overconfident, navigating without notification, and wondered what consequences had ensued. The patient's silent observation, though distant, lingered in my mind, a reminder of how every action, even in maintenance, was watched and measured. The rule existed not just for procedural control, but to prevent unseen hazards from exploiting human error. Once inside, the tunnel seemed alive, a twisting network of pipes, conduits, and shadowed alcoves. The air was thicker, tinged with metallic tang and condensation, and every step felt like a negotiation with unseen forces. I traced the piping carefully, resisting the urge to rush, aware that Rule 10, never enter the maintenance tunnels without notifying the command center, was not arbitrary. The labyrinth amplified disorientation and subtle anomalies, a shifted panel here, a shadow that seemed misaligned there, vibrations that hinted at stress points I couldn't fully measure. Even minor deviation from protocol could cascade unpredictably through the lab's life support systems. Time warped as I progressed further into the tunnels, every minute feeling both elongated and compressed. The hum of machinery above and the distant pulse of water against the hull merged into a rhythm that distorted perception. I caught fleeting reflections in polished conduits, misinterpreted movements, and imagined the consequences of being isolated here too long. The tunnels magnified every instinct, every doubt, every impulse to bypass caution. Even though the fault I was checking seemed minor, I realized the rule existed to enforce constant awareness, to tether attention, and prevent the small mistake that could spiral into catastrophe. By mid-inspection, I was acutely aware of how disorienting the tunnels could be. I mapped them mentally, tracing connections to chambers, conduits, and life support nodes. Yet the physical structure seemed subtly different from schematics, as if the building itself adapted around intrusions. My pulse raced as I imagined becoming trapped, unable to retrace my steps, or worse, triggering subtle malfunctions in systems above. The rule wasn't merely about permission, it was about anchoring observers in a reality where misjudgment could have consequences beyond immediate perception. Compliance demanded vigilance, patience, and respect for the labyrinth's silent, relentless authority. I paused at a junction where pipes converged, condensation dripping from a joint, reflecting light in a fractured pattern. The hatch behind me seemed farther than it had when I entered, and I realized the tunnels manipulated perception, time, and orientation in subtle ways. I considered the command center, the one contact who could verify my location and provide guidance, and I shivered at the potential consequences of neglecting notification. Even a small, seemingly benign decision could disrupt systems, compromise safety, and extend isolation indefinitely. The rule was designed to enforce foresight, accountability, and restraint in an environment that punished assumption. Shadows deepened as I moved further, amplifying every movement, every breath. I imagined the water outside pressing against the hull, magnifying the psychological weight of isolation within the tunnels. My hands brushed against conduits, testing integrity, noting faint vibrations, yet the threat felt larger than mechanical failure. The labyrinth amplified uncertainty, and I understood that Rule 10, never enter the maintenance tunnels without notifying the command center, served as both literal and psychological safeguard, a tether to authority, reality, and collective oversight. Even the smallest breach could ripple through systems, unseen, irreversible. By the time I finally reached the end of the inspection, the tunnels had left their mark, a sense of heightened awareness, tension coiled in every muscle, and a constant attention to subtle cues I might have otherwise ignored. I emerged into the corridor with the weight of isolation still pressing, aware that the rule had preserved not just my physical safety, but my cognitive stability. Even after leaving, the labyrinth's influence lingered, a quiet insistence that boundaries exist not for convenience, but for survival. The rule had anchored me, but its lessons pressed quietly, an unyielding reminder of how fragile control can be in an environment designed to test it. I first understood the chilling weight of Rule 11, never acknowledge or respond to unexpected signals from the external environment during a late shift, when the hull vibrated faintly, almost imperceptibly, in a rhythm that did not match the known patterns of machinery or ocean currents. I froze, every instinct screaming to check, to respond, to investigate. But the rule drilled into me that any acknowledgement could invite consequences I could not anticipate. My hands hovered uselessly over controls, mind racing with rationalizations and worst-case scenarios. The patient's eyes, calm and observing, seemed to understand my hesitation better than I did myself, and I realized immediately that curiosity was a liability I could not afford. The signal was subtle, a brief fluctuation in lighting, a muted oscillation in the hull, a whisper of sound that could have been imagination. I imagined reaching out, communicating, or recording it, and felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Compliance demanded restraint, yet every fiber of my being wanted to act, to assert control over the unknown. The rule was clear. Rule 11. Never acknowledge or respond to unexpected signals from the external environment, and its purpose felt both protective and punitive. Ignoring the signal didn't feel safe. Acknowledging it might be fatal. I stood motionless, every nerve straining, listening to the tension between what I could measure and what I feared. Hours or perhaps minutes passed with the signal recurring intermittently, irregular and unpredictable. Each time it happened, I felt an insistent pressure, as if the external environment itself was testing boundaries, probing for reaction. My mind began cataloging possibilities: structural stress, biological anomaly, mechanical interference, or something entirely outside comprehension. The isolation magnified each occurrence, making the signal feel alive, intentional, aware. I had to remind myself repeatedly that observing without responding was the rule's core tenet, that action could be more dangerous than inaction, even when inaction was torturous. I circled the observation bay, tracing the tubing, consoles, and monitors, grounding myself in the tangible, while the intangible pressed at the edges of perception. The patient's calm presence intensified my awareness, a silent reminder of the consequences of breaking the rule. Every instinct to investigate, to probe, to communicate was countered by the knowledge that authority, protocol, and survival converged here. The rule existed not merely to prevent action, but to preserve equilibrium between observer and environment, maintaining a fragile balance I had begun to understand only through relentless compliance. By mid-shift, the signal persisted in sporadic bursts, teasing perception, challenging restraint. The lights would flicker subtly, the hull would vibrate in faint, irregular pulses, and my mind twisted the smallest anomalies into narratives of catastrophe. I imagined what could happen if I acknowledged even the tiniest occurrence: cascading alarms, compromised life support, or an unseen agent triggered by my attention. Every sense heightened under the weight of restraint, each breath measured, each thought restrained, until the line between observation and participation blurred dangerously. Rule 11. Never acknowledge or respond to unexpected signals from the external environment became not just guidance, but a lifeline in a place designed to bend perception and erode certainty. Hours stretched, the isolation pressing in as I cataloged each anomaly in memory, my eyes trained on the chamber, my attention tethered to monitors and readings. Each signal seemed to carry intent, yet the rule reminded me that intent was unknowable, response fatal. I felt the subtle weight of awareness, the oppressive presence of the external environment pressing at the facility from all sides, and realized that compliance demanded more than physical restraint. It demanded psychological fortitude. Even minor hesitation could be a breach, if it led to engagement, if curiosity overruled caution. As the shift neared its end, the signals became almost imperceptible, faint ripples of anomaly in an otherwise stable system. My body was exhausted, muscles taut, mind alert in a way that fatigue could not dull. I understood the rule's full meaning. Rule 11. Never acknowledge or respond to unexpected signals from the external environment was about control, restraint, and survival, a final boundary meant to preserve stability when the unknown encroached. The patient remained silent, perfectly still, yet impossibly aware, a constant reminder of the fragile balance between observation and engagement. When I finally stepped into the corridor, the residual tension pressed against me, a quiet insistence that even adherence exacts a cost. The hull continued to hum, the ocean pressing invisibly from all directions, and I sensed that even following the rule did not grant relief, only survival. The awareness of potential signals of unseen forces and consequences lingered, making every moment outside the observation bay charged with subtle vigilance. My mind clung to the lesson that restraint was both shield and burden, the invisible line separating control from chaos. And then I felt it again, a subtle vibration beneath my feet, almost imperceptible, like the echo of something waiting just beyond the hull. I froze, realizing that some things required attention not through action, but through endurance. The ocean's pressure, the patient's awareness, the facility's silent mechanisms, all converged in that moment, pressing quietly against every sense. My training, rules and instinct held me in place, yet the unspoken truth remained. Compliance was never complete, never restful, only survival. If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more.